Door locks in the 13th century BC. Some of the most ancient locks, the mostest ancient or earliest locks that you can possibly have, they were made out of wood. Very typically, metal locks didn't come for a long, long time. But these locks were typically wooden. Do you see in the picture on the top left, you've got a weird thing like a bent toothbrush? That's this, actual size. Okay? I'll make it so it looks the same to you, right? Okay, with a couple of teeth on the side here. And you see next to it some odd patterns in like scraps of something there. Those, I gather, are typical patterns of the teeth. Like what would the lock look like for different keys to get in? This is the key of the lock. And then you see the mechanism is basically a couple of pins that come down. They were somehow, they were not spring-loaded. They were weighted. I don't think they had springs yet, but they just had heavy weights. And the action of the key was simply to go, you would notice the guy's hand is coming from the other side of the door through a hole. So through a hole in the door, probably had a little porthole swinging thing for privacy, but put his hand through the hole. He had a copy of the key on the other side. The guy on this side had his copy of the key right there on the door, probably. And then on the other side, the servants had to go get the key. He would push up on the weights, on the pins, and then the whole door can just swing. There's not really much of a latching system. It's just these pins holding it for certain amounts of privacy. This also is maybe a better view of how the weight would work and so forth. It's a very simple, really pretty simple mechanism. This, for those who are listening to the video at home, that's what I'm actually holding in front of you. Yes? Class, am I telling the truth? Yes. Okay, that's the actual thing I made this morning. The counters were doing the money today. That's how I busied myself. And then another view of it. You know what? Why don't you pass that around? You can look at the key. Okay? Yeah, it is like a hockey stick with teeth, right? And much like hockey sticks, it is taped. So, okay. So that the one you see on the screen is a very simple one with just 3 teeth, but you see the weights and so forth. So it would be difficult with your hand to reach in there and do it, but I'm kind of wondering if a woman with good fingernails or a child could be forced to go in there and kind of do it. Hey, you're playing with the... Okay, well, whatever. I guess. All right. So anyway, locking mechanisms. The things that a minister needs to do to show what the text is all about. So, all right, ancient locks. The most ancient locks, what I'm showing you is from Babylon, based on one from Nineveh, the earliest lock known, from not very far from where we are here. Nineveh and Babylon are just about the same, but from the area. And then it got its way down to the Middle East, to Egypt as well. So this area had them. Okay, so. And by the way, if you're not really curious, just pass it along. You won't hurt my feelings or anything like that. So, all right, when he had gone, so back to Ehud, to the text, he closed the doors of the roof chamber upon him and locked them. And then when he had gone, he didn't sneak away. He didn't have to. He just left. So I know that when I was younger and read this, I had the impression that there's a lot of information here, and I was kind of confused by it and what happened. I think he just left by the normal, front door or what have you. Marcia, you can just leave that on the table when you're done. You don't have to do anything special with it. So when they saw the doors of the roof chamber were locked, the servants thought, he's only relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. So for the sake of our younger people, those of us who are Actually, I'm not sure any of us in this room are old enough to actually know this from experience. But if there's no plumbing, how do you relieve yourself upstairs? Say it a little louder, Terry. Chamber pot. It's just a thing. So, I forget what the city was. If it was maybe Richmond, Virginia, during the Civil War, when the Union commander took over the city, he had a terrible reputation. I'm forgetting the actual name of the commander, but he got the nickname Spoons because people accused him of stealing their silver. And the people of the city very quickly and brilliantly made a lot of money by selling chamber pots with his picture on the inside. Can you imagine how innovative that must have been? I don't know what they would have, I guess a couple of stencils and quick paint, and there he is though, General whoever. And they made a lot of money with that chamber. I've never seen one, but I've heard of them. So anyway, chamber pot. So they thought, but they waited until they were utterly at a loss. How long would you wait for the king if you think he's just up on the toilet? How long? That's if he didn't take along the crossword puzzle. I mean, an hour and a half? I don't know how long, but it was part of Ehud's brilliance was to lock the door of a room that had a bathroom facility. So the servants are just going to wait a while because you don't want to be knocking on the door. What happened to the last servant who troubled the king? En cloaca. That's Latin for in the closet. You have to be careful of that. So, okay. So they waited until they were utterly at a loss, way beyond the normal time you would have thought. They could have watched a whole movie. And then, okay, when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key. They had to go get the key. They took the key and opened them, the chambers, and there lay their Lord dead on the floor. And where is Ehud? Ehud escaped while they delayed. And if I had not looked up this name and found out what it means, I would still have no clue. But I'm going to pass it along to you, and I hope the picture helps. So he passed beyond the sculptured stones. Remember those rocks I showed you near Gilgal? So he's going off to Gilgal again and escaped to Syrah, which means shaggy or shaggy forest. So, and there is such a place not very far from Gilgal, because that's the same forest that David's son Absalom rode his mule into. Remember what happened to Absalom? Got his hair caught in the shaggy branches. So off he goes into, can I say Sherwood Forest, and you know what I mean? So north of the city, off he goes, and there he does what a good leader is going to do. How many of you know what I mean if I say a Pyrrhic victory? Mark, I'm not surprised that you know what a Pyrrhic victory is. So typically in our parlance, a Pyrrhic victory it's named after a guy. He was the general / king of a very small Greek city-state. In the earliest days of Rome, before Rome was ever an empire. So very, very long time ago, in the, pre-everything, 400s or 300s BC, in there somewhere. Esther may still have been alive at this time when Pyrrhus was around. And Pyrrhus, we say a Pyrrhic victory because he won some battles that were so costly. It would have been better if he hadn't fought them at all. He won, but lost all of his troops or whatever. But he was also famous for one piece of bad leadership. Pyrrhus was great at winning a battle, but he didn't know how to follow up a battle to his advantage. So he would often fight and then like go home and catch the Late Show on TV. He didn't stay and claim the victory or use it to his advantage. He would just let it go. So what happens here with Ehud is just the opposite. Ehud has just won a terrific moment. He killed the central command of Moab, right? All of the orders and the organization and the authority goes through Eglon. Eglon's now dead, and his staff is in disarray. So what does Ehud do immediately? He goes into the forest nearby, and he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. Come with me, we have something to do. After all, Moab has been here on the west bank for 18 years. It's time to stop that. He said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. They went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites and allowed not a man to pass over. So 18 years ago, I don't know how they got over the Jordan. By boat, by ford, whatever it was. Today, in this moment, they could have used the fords. They could have run across the river because the water was shallow enough in places. But the Israelites blocked the fords. None of the guys from Moab could get across. But remember, Moab is not an organized army right now. Their commander, their king, is dead. They're disorganized. So they're not going to come in force against the squad, brigade that Ehud has placed at the Jordan. They're going to, they're not going to, it's not going to be a major battle. It's going to be a lot of small battles. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men, not a man escaped. Well, they're not organized. I don't think this was one battle. It certainly doesn't have to be from the text. It's more likely that Ehud led his warriors here and there and there and there, garrison to garrison to garrison, wherever they're stationed. It's been 18 years. They would have captured villages and towns. He just leads the people from town to town, up and down, and all of the Moabites on the west bank are dead. He ends that whole thing. And Moab now, they've lost 10,000 warriors. What do they have left? A bunch of widows and children on the other side of the river. So this is his victory. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for about 4 generations, 80 years. In the book of Judges, we have a lot of round numbers. I don't know if 10,000 is the actual number of Moabites killed, but how do you... David, you guys usher occasionally. How do you count? Do you count actual heads or do you count 8 to a pew? Do you count actual heads? Even on Easter? You estimate a little bit and you've got an idea. There are moments where I know that there isn't an usher who's counting, where during the liturgy, I can look at the congregation and look, and I don't count how many pews are full. I count, there are about 3 pews that are empty, and there are 4 or 5 half pews. And that's all I have to know, right? Because I know how many pews we have and how many do a pew. And you get like a little and then because Monday morning, the secretary is going to say, we don't have a count for this one service. And I can think, oh yeah, I remember, and we had about this many, and we did, okay. The land had rest for 80 years. I estimate about 4 20-year generations or so, something like that. All right. Anything up to that point, up to verse 30. We have 1 verse left. Different judge. So anything up to this point with Ehud. Yeah, Mark.
I would offer that a modern example of Pyrrhic victory would be the doctrine of Ned for nuclear war. 10,000 nuclear weapons that are used on the former Soviet Union and the United States.
Yeah, what's left? There's nothing left. Exactly. Yeah. All right. The next judge is our first minor judge. So far we've had Othniel and Ehud, and now we get to our first minor judge whose name is Shamgar. Couple things on your sheet about Shamgar on the back page. Boy, I did not go through anything on the front page with you, did I? I'm sorry. Say that again? Did I? Okay. All right. On the back page, most of this is going to be on the screen anyway for Shamgar here. So Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. The thing about the name Shamgar is it's not Hebrew. Neither is Anath, his father's name. So was he even an Israelite? Is it possible that God could have raised up a complete foreigner to help his people in some way? Yeah, it's possible. He will do it with Cyrus. On the other end of the Old Testament, Cyrus the Great is going to be prophesied by Isaiah and show up in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. But Shamgar could have been an Israelite who just happened to have a father with a different name. Famous Jew in the Bible is Timothy, which is a very Greek name because his dad was a Greek. But he's circumcised and so forth. Anath is a city name. So if he's a son of Anath, his dad could have been named after a god, or he could have just been a guy from that town. Something like that. So there are some cities in America that have foreign names. New Ulm and others, The thing we know about Shamgar is that he too delivered Israel. Quite a statement. How many years ago? In the 90s. I heard Professor Brian Doze do 2 chapel sermons on Shamgar while I was at Northwestern College. Changed my way of thinking about how much text is required to find law and gospel and to apply it to people. Remarkable pair of sermons. A lot. I mean, all of our preaching when I was in college and seminary was amazing. It was a delight to go to chapel every day. Just a delight. But was something I hadn't considered. I have now, but I hadn't then. So again, Shamgar's name is not Hebrew. Anath is not Hebrew. He killed or led a raid that killed. We don't know if he was alone, but he might have been alone, maybe not. Killed 600 Philistines. Who wrote Charge of the Light Brigade? Longfellow? I feel embarrassed not to know that. Anyway, into the valley of death rode the, how many? 600. That's a brigade. In the Old Testament, the 2 most common military unit strengths I've found are 300 and 600. A half brigade and a brigade. When Abraham goes chasing after his captured nephew Lot, when the northern kings raid the resort cities around the Dead Sea, he has 4 half brigades. His own family unit, 318 men, and his 3 Hittite friends. Each have about 300. And so he's got 4 half brigades, 2 brigades, that go up to chase after and catch Kedorlaomer way up north around Mount Hermon and bring everybody back alive. So very common unit strength of 600 Philistines. The ox goad, a short, semi-sharp spear for farm work. Some ox goads had a An archaeologist would call it a pan. I would call it a mini shovel on the bottom. About maybe 6 inches? 6 inches wide, about that tall, but permanently. Was it Tennyson? Thank you very much, Sarah. Appreciate that. He was a lord, wasn't he? Alfred Lord Tennyson. Okay. So can you imagine? I mean, you can imagine being stuck with the pointy end of an ox goad, but what if somebody whacked you over the head with the shovel part? Pretty nasty. And could be easily sharpened. He too delivered Israel doesn't necessarily make Shamgar any less of an outsider. It seems like the Lord saved his people sometimes with outsiders. And he was used by God, but who was he? Picture of an ox goad being used with oxen, and an ox goad without the oxen. So it's a pretty formidable weapon either way, right? You're amused by the simplest of things. I got to do more of that in my Bible class preparation. We have about 9 minutes. May I read to you? Would you mind? You don't have to read it necessarily with me, but this is an excerpt from the very last devotion on my commentary on the book of Leviticus. When I was writing Leviticus, there are extra copies back there by Barb's elbow, I think. You don't necessarily need one, but when I was writing Leviticus, it occurred to me that writing a year's worth of daily devotions on the laws in Leviticus would be a burden on people. So I decided the first week that I would include on every Friday a little pious fiction, a little made-up story. So whatever passage it was, I would have a little story of how the people of Israel maybe applied that law in their lives. And I ended up with all kinds of things, some of them related to St. Paul's and some not. It happened that Hannah Scharf had her last baby while I was on the verse about a woman's time of uncleanness following birth. So that devotion's titled Hannah Had a Baby. That was Ida that was born. Is Ida 6 now? At about or 7? But also, what do they do when they take their sacrifices? What do they do when the Levite wants to get married? Who can he marry? Who can he not marry? What happens when the men bring back a weird animal? They don't know if it's kosher or not because they bring back a giraffe. They don't know what to do with it. Or what about the family sees a dead lizard in the middle of the road? What do? They have to jump over it. Then they play jump the lizard all day, and so forth, and so on. Well, this is the last devotion of those from Leviticus. And I apologize, there were 1 or 2 members of St. Paul's who thought I was writing about my own childhood because I keep saying I and Mama and Papa. I did not grow up in 19th century BC, Israel. Okay. The last long trip I took with Mama and Papa was to see Mount Sinai. They had been here and there in the Promised Land, especially during the days of peace when Ehud was our judge. We had gone to see Moab on the other side of the Jordan, and once we saw the little lake of Galilee. While there, we saw Mount Hermon from a distance with its white peaks and stormy summit. We saw Mount Carmel beyond the thorns and tangles of the plain of Sharon. We had met Edomites, Elamites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites, Philistines, and many other foreigners. The Philistines had changed since I was a boy. Back then, they were almost friendly with us, trading with us and sharing news. Now, Ehud rested with his fathers, and many of Israel's enemies were becoming warlike again, especially the Philistines. We were afraid of the camps they made closer and closer to our mountain on the far southwest corner of Israel. Their camps were becoming villages, and the villages were being turned into fortresses. Mama and Papa wanted to go down to Sinai, and since the road was easy enough, we went, just the 3 of us. Moses said that it takes 11 days to go from Mount Horeb, that is Sinai, to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road. Since Kadesh was just 4 or 5 days' travel from our home, we decided to take that route. It was not the path traveled by Moses down to Sinai. That would have been going down the west side of the land from Egypt. We were going to retrace the route of the second stage of the Exodus backwards. It was fine weather. Rafal had taken over Papa's farm, and we left after planting, so there wasn't that much for him and his new wife to take care of while we were gone. Talia's oldest son, Simeon, was there to help with the herds, and Silly the dog would help. The name Silly was short for Kesila, our word for fool, because she was just the dumbest dog we had ever had. But she was loyal and brave, just like Petty, her mother. Silly had short hair, short legs, and a short nose. And of all our dogs, she looked the least like the wolves from which we started breeding. Everything about that trip was calm, even serene and beautiful. The road was easy, the strangers were pleasant, or at least quiet. The wells were just frequent enough, and the mountain at the end of our happy road was breathtaking. The country going down through the desert of Sinai gets rockier and climbs higher as you go south. And then there it is, Sinai. It's really a line of peaks jagged along the sky like teeth. Of course, Sinai is our word for teeth, and you don't need any help to see it. We sat there in our little camp from the day we got there, the day before a Sabbath, until the next Sabbath had come and gone. 10 days we sat and remembered the law of Moses and talked about it together, and the things Moses wrote there, like the books of Exodus and with its strange tales, and Leviticus with its many, many laws. The return was equally uneventful until we came to the Philistine plain. It was the music that we heard that first alerted us. There were drums, of course. All of the Canaanite tribes used drums for signals and for music in battle. But there was a rasping, bellowing melody that sounded like a whole field of geese hollering at one another. The Philistines had begun to use a Greek instrument for giving signals in battle. I don't know what they called it, but it was a ridiculous, awkward thing mounted on an ox cart. To me, it seemed profane and abominable, like everything the Philistines embraced. A single man could play a melody on the thing with his hands, although how this was done, I have no idea. Reeds were attached by some ingenious device to the playing surface, and as boys pumped wind through the reeds, a tune was played. I hated the sound of the thing from the moment I first heard it. They were playing a song on it now, but only on the south side of their camp. Even as loud as it was, they could not have heard it in our village. Our village sits on the ridge overlooking the central and southern part of Philistia, and it looked to Papa and me as if the whole nation of Philistines had emptied itself to the camp in the valley below. Really, it was just hundreds, but they were warriors, maybe nearer 1,000, just then driving the pegs of their tents to spend the night before moving on. Some of them were singing words to the tune we heard. It looked as if they planned to head right through our village. Most of them were the same size as Papa and me, but some were the Anakim, the giant Philistines, 7 or 8 feet tall or more, with huge spears and shields that dwarfed their shield bearers. The horses and mules of the baggage train were afraid of them, and so were the dogs. And I have to say, so were we. They would tear up our village like a dog tearing up a rag. We had to warn our people. We took the hard path up the southern slope, where once in my childhood I had watched the scapegoat delivered into the wilderness. Everything was a blur for us as we hurried into the camp. Mama began going quietly from tent to tent, home to home, calmly warning everybody of the danger. We knew that she would be the best one for the job. Mama would not let anyone panic. Papa and I ran for our farm. We didn't talk. I think we both knew what had to be done and which of us had to do what. While Papa would gather the people of our village together and move them to the other side of the tribal land, he would tell Rafal to gather up the fighting men and prepare for battle here on the ridge. We saw Rafal coming up from the eastern field, and just as Papa turned to call to him, he saw me picking up one of the old ox goads. I was in a hurry, but he blessed me and said, "Remember the commands and promises God gave us through Moses, my son. You've seen his mountain, but his word lives in your heart. You're a man now, and maybe it's time for you to lead us in the way that Moses and Joshua and Ehud have." I was going to stab into the Philistine camp like a thrown knife, like a shaft of lightning. I would pierce through their rear guard, through their new camp that night, from the twilight to the dawn, and I would give Rafal time to gather our men together. I remembered my brother and I playing games as boys, pretending to be the great and fearless Ehud, the left-handed judge of Israel. I doubted that any boys would ever pretend to be me, but now at last I also wondered whether Ehud had truly been fearless. Courage, I suddenly realized, is doing what has to be done even when you're afraid. As usual, Papa had the word of God in mind. He quoted Moses, 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. There was no time and no need for any other words. I gripped the ox goad and headed down into the Philistine plain, hugging the shadows. I heard Papa's voice following me down with a blessing and a prayer. The Lord will be with you always, Shamgar. And God bless you. Thanks for letting me do this. Have a good week. You've been listening to Invisible Church, the Bible study podcast from St. Paul's Lutheran Church, New Ulm, Minnesota.